In this lecture, we're going to start building out our landing page, and we're going to start with this navigation menu at the top of our page. So let's go back to our code, and quickly before we start writing HTML and CSS, I want to quickly point out that in index.html, let's remove this div from the last lecture. So in index.html, we're actually referencing the output CSS that we went over in the last lecture. So all of the compiled CSS that we're outputting to dist and output CSS, we're referencing in our index.html file. And the other thing that I didn't mention in the last lecture is when we run, if we go to our package.json, when we run this tw:/build command, where we've got this watch flag, so we're watching for our input CSS, any changes in our input CSS, and then outputting it to output.css. We're also watching for files that we reference in our Tailwind config. So for example, with that watch flag, we're going to watch for any files that change that match the criteria in this content array. So we can see we've got a content array here that's referencing directories with a catch-all in here. So we're referencing any files within the source directory and any subdirectories within that source directory. And we're referencing the files that end in HTML and JS. So anytime we have files in the source directory that end in HTML and JS, and those files contain Tailwind classes, then those Tailwind classes will then be included in our output.css. So remember, in the last lecture, I told you that Tailwind CSS only includes the classes that we actually use in our project. So we have to set up which files to watch for in our Tailwind config within this content array. So then Tailwind will watch for any of these files with an HTML or JS extension. And if those files change and contain Tailwind CSS classes, then Tailwind will go ahead and rebuild to the output CSS and contain those new Tailwind classes. So with that said then, in index.html, let's go ahead and add a main tag in here. And within the main tag, we'll add a header tag. And then within the header tag, we'll add a nav tag. Now it's this nav tag that is going to be responsible for rendering this sort of pink color and all of the navigation items, as well as our logo. So let's go ahead and start building this out then. So we want our nav tag to stick to the top of the page. So we can use the position sticky for this. And in Tailwind CSS, we can just use the sticky class. So we can see if we hover over the class name again with the Tailwind IntelliSense extension installed, we can see that it's going to render this position sticky. So then we want to make sure that it's at the top of the page. So we want to set top to 0. And we want that nice pink gradient color that we saw in the completed project. So to do gradients in Tailwind CSS is really easy. We just need to set the BG gradient class name, and then we need to specify the direction of the gradient. So we want the BG gradient to go to the right. So we can go to R here. So we've got BG gradient to R. If we wanted to go to the bottom right, we could go to BR, which would be the bottom right. The top right would be TR, and I'm sure you can guess what the bottom left and the top left class names will be. So that is BL for bottom left, and then top left would be TL. So we can see when we add these class names, then we can see the linear gradient is going to be to the bottom left. So this is the generated CSS, but we want it to go just to the right. So we can see here it's going to right, and then we need to specify the color that the gradient will start at and the color that the gradient will end at. So for this, we need to add a from class. So we can go from and then the color that we want to gradient from. So we want it to be rose 500. So we want the 500 shade of rose that comes out of the box with Tailwind CSS. And then we want to go to pink-500. So we want that 500 shade of pink. So let's just go ahead and add some test text in here in the nav tag. So then if we right click on our index.html, let's go ahead and open in default browser. And we can see here we've got our nice gradient from our rose 500 to our pink 500. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and inspect our output.css. So now if we scroll down right to the bottom of our output CSS, and if we scroll up a little bit from the bottom, we can see now we've got some extra class names in here. We've got a BG gradient to R because we've included it in our index.html. We've got the from rose 500 and the to pink 500. So these classes are now being included in our output CSS because Tailwind CSS has already picked up that we're using them in our index.html, because we told Tailwind to watch out for any of the HTML and JS files within our source directory that potentially contain Tailwind CSS classes. So before we continue adding the logo and the menu items, let's hover over this top for a second, and we can see we have a top of 0 here. So spacing and positioning in Tailwind CSS is very easy. We just need to specify a particular value. For example, top 0 will obviously set the top to 0, but if we added top 1, for example, we can see in the IntelliSense here, we can see it's going to add a top of 4 pixels. Let's go top 2, we can see it's going to add a top of 8 pixels. Top 3, it's going to add a top of 12 pixels. So we can see all of these are in multiples of 4, which means we're not specifying any magic values and magic numbers and things like this when designing with Tailwind CSS, because we're essentially constrained to this 4 pixel grid. So it's exactly the same if we change this back to top 0 because we want top 0. It's exactly the same for margin and padding. So for example, padding, we just add P here, and if we want a padding all round, we can add a P-1, which will give a padding all round of 4 pixels, padding -2 or P-2, which will give a padding all round of 8 pixels, etc, etc. So it all goes up in multiples of 4. So we're sticking with this nice design constraint here in a nice 4 pixel grid. So we haven't got things all over the place with no structure in pixels and things like that. We're designing in this nice sort of 4 pixel grid. And generally what I find as well is I tend to stick with a couple of the same types of values. For example, I'll very rarely use P1, P2, P3, P4, and P5 in a project. I'll generally use things like P2 and P4. Exactly the same with margins as well. I'll generally stick with the same margins and padding for all of my different elements on the page. So if we wanted to add a padding, for example, to the left, we just add PL and dash. And exactly the same, we've got that 4 pixel constraint here with our different values. Padding to the right is done by PR, padding to the top is PT, and padding to the bottom is PB. Exactly the same with margins. We've got M for margin all round, we've got ML for margin left, MT for margin top, MB for margin bottom, and MR for margin right. So as well as specifying a particular side that we want to add some spacing to, we can also specify an X and Y axis. So for example, if we wanted a margin on the top and bottom, we could add an MY, so we're targeting the Y axis. If we wanted a margin on the left and right, we could target MX, which targets the X axis, so we're adding margin to the left and right. And again, we can see in the IntelliSense here that it's going to generate this CSS for this particular class name. So for example, MX0 will add a margin left and right of 0. And let's go down to MX4, for example, and we're adding a margin left of 16 pixels and a margin right of 16 pixels. So we don't actually want to add any spacing to this nav because we're going to add the spacing to our inner elements, for example, the logo and our navigation items and things like that. So we're not going to add any spacing to the nav. However, now we know how we can add spacing in Tailwind CSS. So before we finish up this lecture, let's go ahead and add our logo. So we want our navbar to display flex because we want all of the inner elements in our navbar to display in a single line. So let's remove this test text then, and let's add a div in here. And within this div, this is where we want to add our logo. And specifically, if we take a look at the completed project, we want to add our white logo because we've got two different logos here. We've got our pink logo and our white logo. So in the navbar, we want to go ahead and add the white logo. So in this div then, let's go ahead and add an image tag. And the source we want to set to /assets/images/logo inverted.png. And let's go ahead and specify a width here of 50. So then we want to go ahead and add our little logo text. So this is actual text and it's not part of the logo image. So before we add that then, let's go ahead and save our index.html. Let's go back to our browser and let's hit Command R or Control and R to reload the page. And we can see we're adding our inverted logo here. However, it's looking way too big. So let's go ahead and fix that in our code. And I've accidentally added width instead of width. So it should be width with a D there, and we want to set that to 50. So let's go ahead back in our browser and hit Command R to refresh. And there we go. We've got our inverted logo rendering here. So let's go ahead and add our logo text. So back in our code then, for this div, we want to set this div to display flex as well, because we want the image and our logo text to display horizontally on the same line. So then we want our items to display center, which will align our items centrally on the vertical plane. So it means our text, for example, if we take a look in the browser again, our text isn't going to be aligned right at the top here. It's going to be aligned centrally to the image vertically. So if we take a look at the completed project, we can see we've got vertical alignment here of our text compared to our image, and it's not right at the top of the navbar or right at the bottom. It's centrally aligned, and that is being set using the items center class. So this is specific to flex items. So then we want to go ahead and add some spacing. So I'm going to go ahead and add a padding all around of 2, which will give a padding of 8 pixels all around. And I want to add a gap of 2 as well, which will give a gap of 8 pixels between our image and the text we're about to render now. So let's go ahead and add another div element here, and it's within this div element that we want to add our logo text. So it's between this image and this div with the logo text where we're going to have our gap of 8 pixels. So for this we want to add a class, and we want our text to be bold, so we can add the font bold class here, which will give a font weight of 700, and we want slightly larger text than the default text, so we can add a text 2XL here, which will give a font size of 24 pixels. So let's go ahead and add our logo text then. We want to start with the TW colon, and if we take a look at the completed project, we can see we've got TW colon in a white color, and then the MF for Music Festival is a dark blue color. So we want to add that MF then in a span tag because we want to change the color of this span tag. So let's go MF in here, and let's add a class in here, and we want the text color to be different for MF. So I'm just going to add a text color here of text sky 900. So we'll have this nice dark blue text color here. Just go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser at our local host. We can see we're rendering our logo and our logo text correctly. However, we need to update our TW text color to a white color, and it's a little bit difficult to notice, but we also need to update the font family. So we want to pick a nice font family from Google Fonts and not use the default browser font. So we'll take a look at that in the next lecture, but to finish off this lecture, let's go ahead and update this text color. So back in our code then, we want all the text color in our header to be a white color. So I'm going to choose a text color of Zinc 200, which will give a nice off-white color here. So let's go ahead and save this. And now let's take a look in the browser and give it a refresh. And there we go. We've got our white text color for our logo text. So in the next lecture then, let's continue building out this header, and we're going to add some Google fonts to apply to our entire landing page. So we'll take a look at that in the next lecture.